Welcome back to Every Third House by Margery Frisbie. First couple of pieces of housekeeping. I said I was going to do a catch-up of each chapter as we went along, but I'm not, so pay attention and keep up. Secondly, do yourself a favour and listen to this on your headphones so you don't have to watch my ugly face read this out loud. Chapter 3. The phone ringing when they came in the front door gave Tracy a start. Was someone calling from the hospital about her mother? It was Jan. I never saw you again when you didn't come to study. Is everything all right? Are you okay? I'm okay, but my mother is in the hospital. My grandmother's here. We just went to Chin's. Your mother is in the hospital? I didn't even know she was sick. Jan's voice dropped, lost its bounce, was more measured. Did she really want to hear about it? Tracy wondered. She realised how hard her mother's sickness was to talk about. It was one thing to talk to Graham or her counsellor. It was sudden, she said. I'll tell you about it tomorrow. Jan didn't answer right away. Tracy listened to figure out if Jan felt snubbed. She didn't mean to rebuff Jan's natural interest, but she simply couldn't say one more word about her mother tonight. She thought she'd scream if she had to. Really, she didn't want to talk to anyone about anything. But she knew how sensitive Jan was, how easily offended. To get herself off the hook and Jan off the track, Tracy changed the subject. Alan was over before we went. Do you ever notice he's kind of like Abraham Lincoln? Mollified, distracted, Jan hooted. He's tall enough, but Abraham Lincoln? Are you getting a case on that guy or something? We're both relieved to get onto a new subject, Tracy realised. No, I was just reading how Lincoln was always telling funny stories or doing stuff to get a laugh, and I was reminded of Alan. As a matter of fact, she went on, I'm doing some research on the Lincolns, and I suppose I should get back to it. After they hung up, Tracy decided it was only proper to carry on through the project she said she was busy on. She settled herself in front of the glass doors of the front room bookcases, looking for the book her grandmother had mentioned. She found two possibilities: First Ladies and Wives of the Presidents. I don't expect there'll be much help, she thought, flipping through First Ladies. Both entries were pretty short, probably just a bunch of dates. Tracy was surprised. The 2 pages about Mary Lincoln in First Ladies were explosive as the Civil War canon President Lincoln depended upon. Mary Lincoln was delighted to become First Lady of the land, Tracy read, but her life was a nightmare. Tracy flopped over to get the book directly under the lamp. She wanted a good look at the face of the woman whose life was a nightmare. The headshot in First Ladies showed a round, unhappy face. Mary Lincoln's hair, pulled back in a bun, was decorated with flowers and some out-of-focus round objects for what must have been a gala occasion. Her sombre expression belied her discreet finery. Mary Lincoln's mouth was open slightly, but you couldn't call that a smile, Tracy decided. Mrs. Lincoln's eyes were puffy, with little pockets around them. Maybe that's where she hid all the things she couldn't bear to look at, Tracy thought. She wasn't a woman who'd reveal any secrets willingly, and she looked as if she had secrets. I always thought it would be exciting to be the wife of a president, although better to be president, Tracy mused as she read about Mary Lincoln's life in First Ladies. But this is awful. How could so many things go wrong for one woman? She bore Abraham Lincoln 4 sons she was devoted to. Eddie died when he was 4 in 1850. Willie died in the White House in 1862 when he was 12. Mary Lincoln was holding the president's hand when he was shot in the Ford Theatre in 1865. 6 years later, her son Tad died at 18. Tracy rocked back on her heels and watched the traffic come in starts up Dunton Avenue from the stoplight. How could Mary Lincoln stand it? Those were the family woes that filled her puffy eyes with tears. But there was more. Being the wife of the president brought its own anguish. When Mary and Abe got to Washington, there were hundreds of letters from people threatening to kill her and her husband. More, she was accused of being a spy because her family was from the South. Lincoln had to go before a congressional committee to defend her loyalty. Tracy's eyes wandered to the procession of headlights like shiny punctuation marks in the night. They seemed to accent Mary Lincoln's list of woes. False accusations, assassination attempts, the loss of Eddie, Willie, Tad, her husband, the president. Tracy's head shifted, her eyes mesmerised by the headlights spotlighting that pile of trouble. She thought about the turmoil inside Mary Lincoln and its effect on her little boys. Did they witness their mother's jealous rages? Mary Lincoln wouldn't even allow the president to talk to another woman. And her extravagance? She spent money foolishly. She bought 300 pairs of lace gloves within 4 months, Tracy read. Who does that remind me of? Tracy asked herself. Then she remembered. Imelda Marcos, the First Lady of the Philippines, bought 3,000 pair of shoes. What was their problem? Unbelievable, Tracy thought, pulling her eyes back to First Ladies. But there was more. Tracy's eyes skipped to the phrase she'd been afraid of. Lost her sanity. At the end, Mary Lincoln, who had come to Springfield a sought-after Southern belle, lost her sanity. She imagined she was penniless and about to be poisoned. Tracy did not want to read another word. She wanted to put First Ladies back on the shelf and forget Mary Lincoln. But she couldn't put the book back without noticing the same puffy-eyed picture was on the cover of Wives of the Presidents. That same baffled, aching expression. Those same eyes privy to pain. Tracy switched off the inlaid lamp by the bookcases to go to the kitchen. Suddenly she was conscious of her grandmother's voice. I'll have to stay here until we figure out what to do, Jim. Her grandmother's voice dropped so Tracy couldn't hear what came next. Tracy realised for the first time that losing Grandma's company must be hard on Grandpa. She shrugged. This is hard on all of us, she admitted. Mum, Grandpa, Grandma, me. He's not the only one. Giving her grandmother a chance to finish, Tracy perched on the sofa arm in the dark, watching the occasional car gather speed after its long wait at the corner. The evening rush from the train station over now, the headlights seemed friendlier, their motion promising forward movement instead of a trip to the past. How many times I've watched the cars go by when I haven't had the energy to do anything else, Tracy thought. Mum must have supposed that steady stream was comforting, because she used to prop me up here when I was so sick I couldn't even read. Evidently Mum couldn't have been comforted so easily, though, or she wouldn't be in One West now. But how could she be? Her life was enough like Mary Lincoln that it was spooky. Mum had lost her husband, like Mary Lincoln, and then her little boy. There was a picture in Tracy's head of Mum feeding Ray in the high chair when he was really much too big for a baby's seat. Even without the tray, Tracy only thought 5 was too big for a high chair because she didn't know how sick Ray really was. She blamed Mum for babying him. But who wouldn't baby a kid that sick? And then Dad, so soon after. Tracy shivered, the 2 funerals still fresh in her mind. We have to be brave, Mum had said, and remember we are still a family. Tracy had said, sure, Mum, but it wasn't true. They hadn't been a family anymore. A family pays attention to each other. Mum had stopped paying any attention to her. She'd be asleep, or at least in bed, when Tracy left for school in the morning, and out with one of her sisters when Tracy came home. On the weekends, Mum and Tracy did things together. Well, in a way. One of the aunts was always along. If Mum did any talking, it was to her sister. Life had got pretty lonely. If I'd have known about what was coming next, I wouldn't have complained though, Tracy realised, even in my own mind. She shook her hand to relieve the pins and needles that were pricking her like capricious little insect bites. I've learned that lonely is better than scared, Tracy thought, and I'm scared now. Scared the phone will ring. Scared it won't. Suddenly a bright light shut off the headlights. Ah, there you are, Grandma said. I couldn't see you in the dark. I've been talking to your grandpa. Is he all right? Is he making you come home? Oh, he's fine. What are you doing in here? My hand just fell asleep. I was rubbing it. Tracy pulled her legs up off the sofa and looked at her grandmother. Do you think that Mum's sick because of Dad and Ray? Mrs. Burkhart covered her face with her hands. Now I've done it, Tracy thought. Better never to say anything. Better just to watch those cars go by. To let my life go by like that, in the dark, in slow motion, without speaking. She repeated that to Mrs. Embry the next day, in almost the same words. I guess it's better never to say anything, never to think anything, never to feel anything. Do you think it hurts less that way, Tracy? Mrs. Embry had met Tracy at the east door as she came in. She'd set up this lunchtime meeting. Mrs. Embry repeated the question. Is that why you've never said anything to anyone? Not to your friends, not to your aunts? Were you afraid that admitting your pain would increase it? Tracy shook her head. I didn't reason anything out in my head. I couldn't. You reacted from instinct. I guess, Tracy admitted. Like Mary Lincoln. Gee, I don't know. I didn't buy any gloves. Like your mother. I don't know about that either. What do you mean, like my mother? Tracy was paying attention now. Until you told me last week, Tracy, I had no idea you and your mother had suffered such losses so close together. As if she could tell that Tracy didn't want to continue down that path, Mrs. Embry said abruptly, Have you found out anything about Mary Lincoln? Oh, not that much. Only what I could find around the house. But I do know that she lost 3 sons, and that she was holding the president's hand when he was shot. Did that make you think of anyone else? Yes, Tracy said, slowly. Last night I made the connection. I was looking at some book my mother got for a PTA program that said Mrs. Lincoln lost her sanity when Tad died. He was the 3rd one. But I don't know if she ever got any better. Mrs. Embry's eyes searched the bookcase shelves behind Tracy's head. She craned her head back for a look at the top shelf. Things are better now, she was saying. We know more about what makes people ill and what makes them better. Mary Lincoln never got that kind of help. At least I don't think she did. Now Mrs. Embry was shuffling behind her philodendron to get at the books behind her desk. I'm looking for an Olivia Coleridge book about the Lincolns. She's a very perceptive writer, I think. I bet she'd have something to tell us. Ah, here it is. Mrs. Embry took down a grey book with red type, reading The Apprenticeship of Abraham Lincoln. She turned to the flyleaf. Maybe this won't be so useful after all. Apprenticeship? Sounds like his early days. But here she is in the index, page 64 to 76. Is this a counselling session? Tracy wondered, watching the kids outside crossing the parking lot. What does Mary Lincoln have to do with me? She let her mind trail back to the first afternoon she'd found her mother in bed when she'd got home from school. Did she have the flu? No, her mother said. She just couldn't face getting up. She'd rolled over, her face to the wall. But you've got to, Mum. It's not good for you to stay in bed all day. And not good for me either, Tracy thought now. Nothing has been good since that afternoon. She glanced over at Mrs. Embry, still reading. Tracy knew she wasn't being fair to her mother. Nothing had been really good since the afternoon she'd found her mother feeding Ray in the high chair he was too big for. Now Ray was... Here, listen to this. Mrs. Embry was leaning against her desk, the Coleridge book in her hand. She looked over at Tracy. I've always thought of Mary Lincoln as a Southern belle, but I had no idea how prominent her family was. Coolidge says her sister was Springfield's first lady, kind of without portfolio. Her husband owned enormous tracts of land. Her father-in-law was the last governor of the Illinois Territory and the first senator from Illinois when it was a new state. She was half reading, half talking to Tracy. There was that sister who brought Mary Lincoln, well, she was Mary Todd then, from Kentucky to find a husband in Springfield. She'd already made good matches for Mary's other sisters in that frontier town. I'm going to let you take this, Mrs. Embry told Tracy. I think you'll probably come closer to solving the Mary Lincoln mystery from this than from those other books. For instance, Coolidge says Mary was one of 14 children her father had by 2 wives. Listen to this. Tracy could see that Mrs. Embry was really getting into Mary Lincoln. She was impulsive and willful, a girl who wanted her own way, lost in the middle of an enormous family. She learned to assert herself by tears and tantrums. Mrs. Embry handed Tracy the book. Here, take it. See what you get out of it. It's only the beginning of her story. She flipped to the last chapter. It ends when they leave Springfield for the White House, but I bet you find clues. Maybe something about the boy's early years too. Tracy piled the book on top of her textbooks for her late classes. That's what I really want to know about, Tracy realised. What about those kids? What about the kids in every third house? What about me? Until next time, good night.